Hi everybody, it's great to be with you even though virtual, and I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to see each other at the Milk Conference this year. But what we're going to be talking about today is how to create a succession plan when your kids are not going to be your successors. So we're going to talk about some concepts that regardless of if it's a family transition or a non-family transition, a lot of this stuff, it plays out exactly the same. So if you are a farm family who's watching this video and your kids happen to be your successors, you're still going to pick up a lot of information in this video that would be critical for you to have in your toolbox as you begin your succession planning process. So let's start out today by just talking about why planning for succession is so critical. So as you get started, particularly if you are planning a succession with a non-family member, clarity is going to be really important. So knowing what your time horizon and having that clearly spelled out is one of the first things that you're going to want to determine before you actually start talking to a successor about coming into your operation. It's important because a non-family succession plan oftentimes has more of a business transaction quality to it. When we're talking about succession for family members, typically there is a much longer time horizon where that person is working in the operation, as well as the fact that family members oftentimes will be a lot more patient than what a non-family transition would look like. So knowing what your time horizon is, when it is that you want to start to wind down or out of the operation, and when you want that transaction to be finalized. You'll want to be planning with what I call the A-B plan. So plan A would be that you're creating a succession plan with a non-family successor. But if that doesn't work out or you cannot find someone to be that person, you'd be working with plan B, and that might be to wind yourself down and out of the operation. Both of those require a tremendous amount of planning, particularly with that end in mind, simply because in both cases there could be some tax events that you want to be mindful about. You're also going to want to be thinking about what is it that you as the transitioning owner want to do post farming or post running your operation. And that's really critical because a lot of times if we don't have that plan in mind, what happens is there's a tendency for owners to want to come back into the operation simply because they don't know what they will do as they transition out. You'll see here that I have a plan C. And sometimes we create one of those because maybe it's a nephew or a niece that's coming in, which that would still be considered a family member that's transitioning in, but sometimes that has a little bit different consideration than if it would be a son or a daughter who is taking your operation over. So just know you can have any number of variations, and it's fine to plan with variables because when we're talking about succession planning, we're usually talking about a 5 to 10 year transition period. And so in that amount of time, there's a lot of uncertainty, and therefore we have to plan for contingencies. So really important that you're planning with multiple scenarios in mind so that you are prepared for whatever might come your way as time passes by. So when we start talking about non-family succession, and again, for those of you who are watching this that have a family successor, this still really does apply to you. So when we think about that person, it's really a very good place to start is to create that job description. So inside the job description, it would be what is that person supposed to do and what are you looking for in a person that would take over your operation. So that we might be looking about value alignment. So looking for a person that is like-minded, holds the same values, has an intention of running your operation, maybe not in an identical way, but with the same values in mind. A values misalignment when we're talking about succession often it will cause derailment simply because that the transitioning owner and the successor just simply are not on the same page about how people should be treated, how the operation should be run. There's a lot of different things that come in of values misalignment. So wanting to create the job description and identify those. You're also going to want to look at what talent or what skills does that person need to have if they're coming from the outside. Because a lot of times what we're finding is that a person is not going to come into your operation fully prepared to start taking over. You're actually looking for a person who has the right attitude, the right desire, the right value alignment, the right drive, and we're actually grooming that person into the role. So a couple of things about that is, number one, it does take a little bit more time if you're, not getting kind of a fully prepared person to step into that successor seat. But we also need to make sure that as we go through and we're looking for that person, we're also thinking about how will we properly onboard them to make sure that that transition is smooth. So the next thing people often ask me is, where do we find them? And so having a solid plan for how you will go out to the marketplace to start to identify a person who would be willing to potentially move into your area and start working with you in order to learn your business and your operation in order to be a true value addition to the operation and at some point in time, potentially your successor. If you're starting from ground zero, as we know, this is going to take some time. So you're going to have to figure out in that time horizon, how early do we need to start looking for that person in order to have them identified, moved, started with the operation, and have enough confidence in them to actually start transitioning some of the things that you do today to them. We've got an operation that we're working with right now that we are going through that process, and we've got a 5-year time horizon for when that owner wants to start transitioning. We are starting to look today, knowing that we need to get that person on site within the next 12 months in order to have a long enough period where we can determine if they're a good fit. Are they working well with employees? Do they have a true interest in the business? And then also to be able to start downloading some of that historical knowledge about the operation in order to make sure we have a successful transition. So some ideas for where you can look. Of course, there's job boards. You can go through some of the universities. They've got matching programs. You can also just go straight out to the marketplace and start asking peers if they know of anyone who's looking for an opportunity. So there's a variety of ways that we can get that person identified, but I will say that if that's the path that you want to take, you need to start that process really early because it does take some time, and you don't want to feel as though you're stuck with the one person who shows up. You want to make sure that you've got plenty of time to do an appropriate interview process. You've got plenty of time to make sure that they're a good fit, that they have time to meet your team, that they have a good feel for your operation, and that it's a win-win. It has to be good for them. It also has to be good for you. So you've got to really leave some time to make sure that your interview process is solid and that you're making a decision based upon all the facts, not just out of necessity. So I talked about an interview. So the interview process can be quite lengthy when we're talking about a non-family successor, simply because they might be coming from another operation. They may be coming with absolutely no background. They may just be in a parallel industry of some kind. So it's somebody who knows your business but maybe has never actually worked in your business. So the interview process, we're looking for alignment, values, talent, drive, all of that. But we're also interviewing them for expectations. What are they expecting from you? How fast do they expect that transition to occur? What are the things that they're looking for in terms of lifestyle for themselves and for their family? Is your community going to support them appropriately? So you've really got to go through a pretty in-depth process, and I would say take it over multiple conversations. A good interview process is going to have an interview with you. It's going to have a tour of your operation. They're going to meet your key managers and key employees. They're going to meet family members who could potentially still be owners of some aspect of your operation, even though perhaps the successor is taking over the operational assets. So you've really got to kind of do a 360 view on that interview process, because it's not just you that needs to be comfortable. It could potentially be a lot of shareholders that are interested, as well as all your stakeholders, and your stakeholders being all your employees. So that interview process needs to be very robust. It needs to be held over a period of time. If you can, interview the wife or the spouse of your successor, simply because you want to make sure that the spouse is comfortable with the potential move. You want to make sure that you're answering any questions that he or she may have regarding the community, the operation, what that transition plan will look like. So, spend a lot of time on the front end of this conversation to make sure that everybody's comfortable before you actually pull the trigger and get into business together. So, what does that look like when we do a solid onboarding and transition process? So, you need to have a plan clearly in mind, documented and outlined before you actually start. So, sit and really make a comprehensive list of what they're going to need to learn or be able to demonstrate that they can do, and by what time. So, pulling out that transition timeline is going to be really important. So you're going to actually be planning two transitions. You're going to be planning their transition in, and you're going to be planning your transition out. So both of those things are going to need some careful consideration, simply because if you as the transitioning owner don't make that transition out in a somewhat timely manner, you're actually going to put strain on that relationship, and you're going to cause tension that nobody wants to see. That tension sometimes can cause the successor to actually leave the operation, and we've seen that happen before. So we've got to have a steady progression of that transition in order to make sure that everybody stays happy and healthy inside that process. So once you get the transition all lined out and kind of figure out the major tasks, the major milestones, you also have to make sure that you're building in an evaluation process. So it's infrequent when we're going through transition that we sometimes think about giving people feedback. So are they meeting expectations? Do they have everything they need to be successful? Are we giving them feedback not only about what is not going well, but also what's going right? It's really important that successors understand what they're doing that are truly meeting your expectations. So we need to have feedback. The feedback can also be tied to some of the transition of equity. So as that ownership is starting to transition over, it should be tied to performance metrics, should be tied to that cultural alignment. So are they leading your team well? Are they being an active participant in the community? If that is important to you, are they doing the things that you would like them to do in order to be a great successor for your operation? So that evaluation process, that feedback is really important. And you need to be setting that up more frequently in the beginning, because you want to set all of those times that you're going to be talking and making sure that everybody's on the same page. But as the transition progresses, you should be, having those quarterly or biannually or annually at a bare minimum to make sure that we're all on the same page and expectations are being met. There's also should be a component as you're thinking about an onboarding plan about deal breakers. What would absolutely cause this deal to fall apart? And that should be from your perspective, but we also need to understand what their deal breakers are. Everybody has a deal breaker. There's very few transactions where you can honestly say that we can put up with anything, we can tolerate anything, and we're okay with anything. Sometimes there is an absolute line in the sand, and we need to make sure that we're aware of those, because sometimes when those get crossed, it's really hard to put those deals back together. We've got faith that is broken or trust that is broken. So it's very, very difficult to be able to put those together if we cross those lines. So important to have those clearly articulated before you ever get started. The timeline piece, again, is really important. And that can be so hard for transitioning owners to say by this year or by the end of this cropping cycle or, whatever that is, I want to be fully transitioned. So that can be a hard number or a hard date to try to figure out. But if you are working with a non-family successor, it's really important to have that, because the business transaction part of the transition is going to be tied to that. So if your expectation is that you're going to continue for 10 years, that may actually be a bit of a deal breaker for someone who's coming into your organization, particularly if they're a little later in their career. They might want to see that timeline shortened up. You may not be able to get as short as they want to go. So if you've got a seasoned operator that's coming in, they may want to see that timeline shrunk a bit. But I'll tell you, if you're not comfortable with that, I would encourage you to kind of negotiate that to a little longer place. And the reason why you may want to do that is because that is maybe the time horizon that's going to give you the time horizon you need to kind of get your affairs in order to be out of the operation, but also you may feel that you need that amount of time to get really comfortable that this person that you're selecting is the right fit for your operation long term. So the timeline gets really critical for a couple of different reasons. One thing that I would very much encourage you to get in your head, like really early on as you start to go through this, and this is for whether you've got a non-family successor or a family successor, is to just get into your mind that you're going to have to communicate a lot. Succession planning is a process that it would be almost impossible to communicate too much. There are a lot of moving pieces to these transactions because there's not only an ownership transition that is happening, but there's a management transition that's happening as well. So making sure that you're setting aside time for operational meetings as well as time for communication about the ownership transition. It's really important. Sometimes we feel like, well, things are going really well, we can back off on the communication, or we don't need to communicate quite so frequently. And I would encourage you throughout the entire transition process, just set up that meeting tempo for how frequently you are meeting. Those operational meetings should be happening every week. And that, again, is whether it's a family successor or a non-family successor. Those are incredibly important meetings, because that management succession piece is really, in a lot of ways, a lot more complicated than the ownership transition. The ownership transition is just, it's an agreed upon transition of ownership that comes with a fee. Over here is where all the messy stuff happens, right? You've got all the management decisions. You've got to have confidence that that successor can make those and make them well. You've got to have confidence that that person can run the financial portion of your business and keep that operation viable, because as you start to transition, if that operation doesn't remain viable and you're doing a buyout over time, that's going to get really problematic, because if the operation can't make your payment, that could be probably something that I would consider as a deal breaker, and the whole thing could fall apart. So you want to make sure that you are absolutely confident and are communicating on a very frequent basis about all of the things that are happening inside your organization, and making sure that your successor's got a good handle on that, so that when it comes time to do the ownership transition piece and where money is being exchanged, you have confidence that that operation is going to be able to sustain those payments over whatever time is agreed upon. So really, really critical that you establish a good meeting tempo if you do not already have that happening inside your organization. That is one of the things that I think is really important to any type of succession plan, is that we have a management operating system in place. So how we are going to manage, how many meetings are we having, how are we doing, some of the strategic goal setting, but then also having a very solid business plan and budget in place, so that those two things complement each other, and we know and we have a way of measuring whether our successors are truly leading the operation, or if they're just floating along on some good historical sort of traction that you've established. So those two pieces together are going to be the way that you're going to be able to measure and monitor the progress of your successors, to make sure that they are prepared to handle the operation when it's time for you to step back. So again, you cannot communicate too much inside of any type of a succession planning and transition period. So let's talk a little bit about the power of documentation, because if you are going to have a non-family successor come into your business, obviously we are going to have to be prepared to put some documentation in place to make sure that everybody's on the same page, and we've got something that sort of lays out how that transition of ownership will occur. So the first thing that I'll say is basically document everything. So in relationships where there's trust and faith, a lot of times we get into handshake deals, which is where we verbally agree to something, we shake hands, and away we go. The challenge with that inside of succession plans is it's very easy to forget what was agreed upon. And the other thing is it doesn't really take continuity planning into play. So if we have a handshake deal, it's not documented, and something happens to either one of the parties, it will be very hard to prove that that was ever agreed upon. So you want to kind of go into any type of succession discussion where we're making decisions together, that we document it all. Now, does that mean we need to run to the lawyer and get an official document every time we make a decision or determine how something is going to work? Absolutely not. It can be as simple as just making sure that inside your meetings that you are, kind of keeping notes, and that you are sending notes to each other to make sure that you're both in agreement. So the way that this would look is sit and have the meeting, somebody type up an email, say, this is what we agreed to, please confirm if that is the way you understood it. And so we've got an agreement that comes back that says, yes, this is how I understood it. Or if that's not the way they understood it, we have an opportunity right then and there to have another conversation and iron that out. So it's not really so much about having everything legally documented, but just making sure that we have a record of the decisions and agreements that we're making. There is a certain part of this that you absolutely are going to have legally documented, and that really is about the transaction itself. So, what are you selling the operation for? When are payments due? When does equity transition? Are we going to put some kind of governance in place to help manage and monitor the performance of the operation while money is owed to the transitioning owner? So if somebody is bringing, pure cash to the table and buying you out, that's one thing. But if you are planning on helping to support a transition by sort of being the bank and allowing payments to be made over time, you're absolutely going to have to get that documented by a lawyer so that you've got a record of that. We have an interest rate that is set, and we're taking into consideration what we believe the operation can afford in order to keep the operation viable, like we talked about earlier, and make sure that it can continue to make its payments to you. So there is a lot of things that you need to kind of keep track as you move through those conversations. But the most important thing is just making sure that you avoid the handshake deals or any kind of conversation that may be relevant to a discussion in the future or action that needs to be taken in the future. And you just want to make sure that you're on the same page and that everyone is absolutely clear and in agreement about what those agreements are. So inside of this, you've got the ability to say, my expectations are not being met. So usually inside of these documents, there is, the triggers which say, okay, expectations are not being met, or you're not performing as expected, and here is my recourse. So you want to make sure that your documents, contain buy-sell language. You make sure that you take the continuity planning into place. So what happens if your successor becomes disabled, gets divorced? What if the two of you get into a disagreement? And certainly what would happen if that successor would die prematurely. So you're going to want to take all of that into consideration and make sure that you've got a contingency plan for that, and that you're able to have some continuity. Because at some point in time, you probably are going to not want to see that operation come back onto you to try to manage that, 10 years into a succession. So you want to make sure that you've got that all documented and you've got a plan for what will happen if something bad happens. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about derailment, because obviously inside these very complex transactions, that is a real possibility, whether you're working with a family successor or whether you're working with a non-family successor. These are the things that we need to really be thinking about in order to avoid them. So make sure that before you actually start getting into business together, that you talk about how will you deal with conflict. So oftentimes inside of a succession plan, you want to make sure you've got your continuity plan in place. So the continuity plan is going to deal with a couple of different things. And typically inside farming operations, it is a single document called a buy-sell agreement. So inside of that, what you're going to be talking about is what will we do if we have a disagreement? So how do we navigate through that? What happens if there is a premature death? What happens if someone gets disabled? And of course, what happens and how will we handle a divorce situation? This is particularly critical, if you're thinking about a non-family successor, because if any of those things were to occur, what will happen to the operation? Is that going to come back to you? And then you have to figure out how to get that through basically another transition where you're starting over, or you may at that point actually be looking at winding the business down. So you want to make sure that you've taken all of those things into consideration and have an agreement in place. You're also going to want to make sure that you talk about how will decisions or the ultimate decision-making authority be dealt with, and when will that transition occur? So does that transition when the equity shifts and your successor becomes the majority owner? But you'll want to be talking about all of that, because oftentimes when successors come in to a transition scenario, they're looking for that ability of when do they get to start making decisions, when do they get to start taking the operation toward the future that they're envisioning. So you're going to want to be really crystal clear about that to make sure that that's covered and you don't end up getting into some misalignment of expectations at somewhere along the transition. And then of course, you want to be really, keeping those deal breakers front and center, because it's one thing to say you've got a deal breaker at the very beginning of a transaction when everybody likes each other and everybody's excited and the future is very compelling. Your deal breakers might change as you start working together. So you're going to want to continually be thinking about those, make sure that that line, wherever that is, that you're staying far away from it, because once that line gets crossed, oftentimes it's really hard to get those working relationships back on solid ground. We usually get a lot of disappointment inside of those types of events. So you want to just make sure that you are being really, really purposeful about having all of those things discussed and making sure that everybody's on the same page. You also need to be really aware in terms of derailment about what's going on with the rest of your team. So you've got, potentially a lot of employees who are watching all of this. And if you're bringing in someone from the outside, there's going to be, not unexpectedly, a lot of nervousness, potentially fear. People may feel that their jobs are in jeopardy. They may be uncertain about if they want to work for anybody other than you. A lot of times loyalty comes into play, and that can make these transitions really difficult for employees. There really are two types of conversations that you're going to want to make sure that you're having. You're going to want to make sure that you're communicating very thoroughly to your management team and the team that you kind of rely on for helping keep everything on track in the operation. There's another level of conversation you're going to want to have with the general employee, or the people who maybe are not so in tune to all of the inner workings of the organization, but are still very aware of what's happening and what may affect them. So you've got those two levels of conversation that are happening in the operation. You may also have a third level of conversation which needs to be happening with any of your heirs or people that will still be, potentially inheriting some of the operations assets like land. So those three levels of conversation, you need to keep those in mind. You need to also be making a plan for those. So how frequently will those conversations occur? My, sort of coaching to you is be as transparent as you feel it that you can be. There are certain things that not everybody needs to know, but certainly there are things that at some levels they need to really be brought into that kind of inner circle and be made very aware of what is going on, what agreements have been made, and what expectations there are for that incoming successor. You're also going to make sure that you're really crystal clear about chain of command. An incoming successor, a lot of times the employees will try to run around them and get to you. So you're going to find yourself in the middle of conversations that you shouldn't be in the middle of if you're not very purposeful about setting up that chain of command and what your expectations are in terms of your employees communicating with that successor. So just kind of know that inside of succession, the more you can communicate, lay out your expectations, and hold people accountable to those, the easier that this is going to be on you and your successor. I'll just leave you with this. We've talked about a lot of things today. These transactions can be fairly complicated. However, just know the more time you put into planning for them, really looking for that proper successor, making sure that you've got someone that you're not only very excited about and are looking forward to working with, but someone that you believe is going to be able to carry forth your values. Make sure that your employees are going to be treated right. Make sure that they've got the ability to learn everything that they need to know to take over an operation that might be as complex as what yours is. All of those things are really important to get a lot of time spent on that front end. The more time you spend on the front end, the less time you're going to have solving problems and working out issues as you get into the transaction. I've given you some resources here. Our website is full of resources. We are publishing things all the time about just different aspects of succession, things that can happen, how to deal with some of the issues, how to work through some of the solutions. So I hope that you'll take a moment to just come and join us on some of these channels. YouTube is a great place to get a hold of all of our videos. We've also got an online succession program called the DIRT Project, which, basically lays out the entire thing for you, including all the tools, all the conversation starters, all the assessments. So basically everything that you would need to be able to walk your farm and your family through a succession planning process and implementation. You can find that in the DIRT Project. And of course, always look forward to a great conversation. So if there's anything that I can do to help you, please reach out. We'd love to hear from you. And thank you very much for joining us today.